It's time for French politics here on France 24. I'm Mark Perlman.
And I'm Molly Hall. Coming up in this edition of the Political Brief, Emmanuel Macron does damage control in the Caribbean as the French government is blasted for its handling of Hurricane Irma.
And showdown on the streets. The unions are demonstrating against labor reform. Macron is being put to the test as he goes for a major overhaul.
And Marine Le Pen promises to reboot the National Front, but some doubt her ability to lead the far-right party.
A political storm sparked by a real-life disaster. The French island territories of Saint-Martin and Saint-Barthélemy ravaged by Hurricane Irma.
Well, the French government has been heavily criticized for not doing enough to prepare for the deadly storm and for failing to react quickly.
The hurricane is gone, but a political storm is raging against the French government. Opposition leaders from the left and the right have been speaking out against what they say was an insufficient and slow response to the disaster.
The government doesn't assume its role. It doesn't have sufficient means of protection.
Ciotti, as well as far-left leader Jean-Luc Mélenchon, have called for a parliamentary inquiry to look into the government's actions. The Prime Minister hit back, criticising the opposition for politicising the disaster.
Those who suddenly claim to be experts in crisis management and emergency logistics in order to stoke controversies which, in my opinion, are as useless as they are counterproductive. They do nothing for the local population.
The Interior Minister also defended the government's response to Irma and to the pillaging that ensued on the islands.
If Mr. Mélenchon and Mr. Ciotti want to call for big reconstruction efforts for the island, if they want to help MPs there, we totally agree with that. As for a parliamentary inquiry, we are in favor of having an evaluation and willingly accept the idea. It will show just how much our teams were mobilized during the crisis.
The question remains about how well prepared the government was before the onslaught. It was difficult to assess the risks of the hurricane, as the initial forecast predicted a Category 3 storm with various possible trajectories. It hit the Caribbean islands only 14 hours after it was upgraded to Category 5. No mass evacuation was organised, and residents were instructed to board up their houses instead. The government insists that necessary measures were put in place. Military and medical reinforcements were mobilised from mainland France to nearby Guadeloupe, ready to send help to the affected areas.
Well, President Macron traveled to the Caribbean to oversee the relief efforts. He said that he was in favor of a parliamentary probe. However, he strongly defended the government's efforts.
The Prime Minister, coordinating with the rest of the government, responded as soon as we received the information, so several days ahead of time and then constantly throughout this crisis. What we've put in place since the beginning of the crisis is one of the largest airlifts since the Second World War.
The French president under pressure back here in mainland France as well. He faces a series of street protests over his proposed labor reform. Things kicking off this week with demonstrations called by the far-left CGT union across the country. Its Secretary General wants the French president to slow down and listen.
We had other governments that started with a strong stance and then had to back down. The president should take the time to listen to the people instead of trying to divide us.
Well, as we just heard from Martinez there, we have certainly been here before. A new government on the left and right comes into power and promises to push through labor reform.
I won't withdraw my welfare reform plan. That would be a mistake, and it would be wrong.
Now, ultimately, they backed down in face of union pressure and massive street protests. It was the case back in 1995 with Prime Minister Alain Juppé, who you just saw there, and then again in 2006 with Dominique de Villepin.
I wanted a strong proposal because I believe that we need more than the state's involvement. We need a better balance with a more flexible labour market and more security for employees. That's the only way to fight unemployment in our country. This was misunderstood, and I regret it.
Well, Molly, the latest attempt was just a year ago when François Hollande was forced to water down his much-opposed reform package.
That's right, Mark, but now it is Macron's turn, and the president says he's trying to loosen labor regulations, but unions say he'll weaken workers' rights.
However, what's different this time around is that after weeks of negotiations, 2 of the country's 3 big unions are not taking part in the first demonstrations.
That's right, but now the government plans to adopt the new decrees next week, and labor reform has always been a heated issue here in France. The president added fuel to the fire by lashing out at his opponents during a visit to Greece.
I am fully determined. I will not yield, whether to those who are lazy, to the cynics, or the extremes. And I ask you to have the same determination every day.
Now, one word that stood out for many, what the president said, was the word feignant. That means lazy. His critics hit back right away, many of them taking to Twitter. The far-right National Front's Florian Philippot tweeting, "Clearly insulting the people comes naturally to Macron." Well, we heard from socialist Martine Aubry, who reacted by saying, and now from abroad, because once again, Macron was speaking in Greece, saying the French are lazy, how scornful and ignorant. While the far left's Jean-Luc Mélenchon said Macron doesn't like the French, give it to him the 12th and the 23rd of September. #lazy. Once again, that's the France unsubmissive calling for people to pile on the pressure in the protests.
Well, the French president using the word feignant has clearly also grabbed the headlines here in France.
Yeah, that's certainly the case, Mark. We saw in Libération, it was certainly on the top page, as well as in the left paper, L'Humanité, we saw it grab the headlines. This, despite the criticism, we saw the president certainly stand by his statement.
I meant all the people who think we shouldn't change anything in France or in Europe. I was crystal clear. I was speaking to those who thought 15 years ago that we couldn't change a thing, and who now are waking up, with Brexit, with Poland turning its back on us, a European crisis, and the difficulties facing France.
Well, the president also took heat from Marine Le Pen, the far-right leader, back in the political scene. Her National Front party took a hit after this year's election, with Marine Le Pen's dreadful performance in the presidential debate sowing doubts for the first time about her leadership. The former presidential candidate says she's determined, quote-unquote, to revitalize her movement. But as Sanam Chantier explains, many in her party think she's not up to the task.
Only 4 months ago, she was a candidate in the most closely fought race in France's modern history. Soon after her stinging defeat, Marine Le Pen left the spotlight. And now, after the summer holidays, she's back in a bid to revitalize her movement. Speaking to a crowd of supporters in the town of Barchet, the 49-year-old billed herself as the president's main opponent.
The new organisation will have a new name that we will have a chance to talk about during our discussions and that you will choose. The way that our party functions will change, and maybe, based on some people's desire, it will be more decentralised.
An official in her party has since said Le Pen has even decided it was time to give up plans to leave the Eurozone. But that's just the tip of the iceberg for the far-right party leader. First and foremost, her credibility has suffered. According to a Sunday newspaper poll, 73% of French voters believe she isn't cut out to be president. Next comes Le Pen's damaging TV debate against her then opponent Emmanuel Macron, which many say has dented her image. That was her final opportunity to prove to her people only days before the vote that she was indeed presidential material. And of course, there's the political infighting and finger-pointing within the National Front, which has weakened the party's image. It all kicked off with the firing of a regional official, Sophie Montel. That was last week. This as the party tries to raise its profile and reset its priorities while injecting their extremist ideology into France's political landscape.
Now, finally, Mark, we're going to take a look at what not to do when you are elected to public office. We've got one MP from the ruling party who's now in a bit of hot water after she was found offering tours at the National Assembly. Well, the problem is that Pascal Fontenelle-Persson was charging €119 a pop. Now, a fellow MP lashed out, saying that the National Assembly is not a startup. And we did find the MP immediately backed down, but the Speaker of the National Assembly says that he could ask a higher court to review the case and that the MP could eventually be forced out. Now, this certainly is an embarrassing hiccup for the party that's promised to clean up French politics.
Well, that's all we have time for, and we'll leave you with some images from the French streets and the clash over labor reform.
Yes, indeed. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you again next week on the Political Brief.
People and Profit, presented by Stephen Carroll.
Business news is not about numbers, nor percentages and statistics. Business news is about people and how we live our lives. People and Profit goes beyond numbers to analyze how the global flow of money and profits shape our world. Intelligent and accessible, the show cuts across business, economics and politics.
People and Profit, on France 24 and France24.com.